We fancy that we have two parties and that there's a difference between them. Rome didn't bother with that. It was a uniparty state, like the Soviet Union, like the People's Republic of China. When I close my eyes and imagine the voices of the Senate and the Congress, do we have a uniparty state? It begins to bother me that there's no difference between them.
Of course we do. That's what we've had all along. That's why the global war on terror was supported ardently by both parties. The change occurred, though, with the rise of Mr. Trump.
Germanicus is here. This is a live broadcast from Londinium, where it is a chilly spring evening. The Thames is okay, but it could be calmer. There's wind. The Centurions are still with us, and it's fun to talk to them about their previous campaigns. They're all retired now, and they reflect on their successes. It is 91 AD. Domitian. Each week, I remind you, we have an emperor who's inadequate. The Senate's very angry with him. That will eventually move to an assassination plot that's successful, but not yet. Germanicus and I spend most of our time talking about the 21st century. Occasionally, as we will today, we address some aspect of our century. We're also going to speak today of the 4th century AD, which is arguably the last of the empire, the last successful century of the empire. After that, it becomes a little dodgy. It's an argument, though. I don't charge into it. I just mention. We're going to spend some time about the 4th century and how it has echoes in the 21st century, especially in the U.S. Congress, which fancies itself a republic. Germanicus, a very good evening to you. Thank you for joining a conversation about headlines from the 21st century. When last Germanicus and I were able to speak in this unusual fashion from the 1st century AD to the 21st century AD, we were on the eve of a promised phone call between the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, and the President of the Russian Federation, Mr. Putin. Well, that phone call did go forward. We were told by the readouts in both camps that it lasted 2 hours, that it was generally jovial, and talked about investment in Russia post-Ukraine war. There was no resolution about the conflict. And afterwards, to characterize it quickly, Mr. Trump said, Europe, this is your problem. You settle it. Speaking, of course, to London, to Paris, to Berlin, to Rome, to other capitals of the European Union and NATO. And that was the last Mr. Trump had to say about it so far. Where it's a week later, new things could come up, but we've got headlines out of Europe, Reuters reporting, for Germanicus to comment on. You will recall Germanicus has been very confident in his measure of the Ukrainian-Russian war for some months, years, and there's no reason to change on the basis of these headlines. Russia launches war's largest air attack on Ukraine, kills at least 12 people. And then Russia and Ukraine swapped 307 soldiers on second day of POW exchange. And then German minister, more sanctions against Russia needed, deep concern. And then ex-army chief of Ukraine army says Ukraine cannot hope for a miracle to restore 91 borders. And then finally, what we're looking at right now is a large plume of smoke rising from Kyiv after the Russian attack. So Kyiv is burning, according to the Reuters report in these last hours. Germanicus, I turn to you because the inability of Europe to settle this very much reminds us of the troubles of the 20th century, which we thought at the end of the 20th century we had escaped, at least in terms of ideology. Russia was capitalist. East Europe was capitalist. Yes, there were exceptions, but at that point, it looked very much like the People's Republic of China was moving in a capitalist fashion. So no ideological fervor on either side. And therefore, we presumed that the markets would settle it. But here we are, watching Europe one more time, unable to answer its own troubles, its own problems that it has known about for at least 200 or 300 years. which is the factionalism around the Russian Empire. So right now, how do you measure, a week after that phone call where Mr. Trump said, you guys do it, how do you measure the Ukraine conflict? Good evening to you.
Good evening, Gaius. The move that Trump made, namely to begin to cast himself and by extension the United States off of the outcome of the conflict, is potentially an adroit move, depending on how he follows up, in large part because he was in danger of getting boxed in. He had announced, declared, trumpeted that he would end the war right away. Then he discovered that it was complex, and he discovered something else as well. In spite of his desire to end the war, it is extremely difficult for the main protagonist, the main instigator, if you will, of the war over the course of the decade, near decade 2014 to 2022, would then, that is to say the US, be a mediator in a war in which it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, participant on the belligerent side, assaulting Russia. And to avoid getting sucked into being the owner of the war, as it were, the baton of marshal of the war being passed from Mr. Biden to Mr. Trump, would be unbearable. It would unravel the Trump presidency, and it would make a mockery of all of his goals, even his vision. So to withdraw allows him to hand the entire tar baby off to our NATO allies. And then they become the protagonists. They become the main belligerent against Russia, continuing to funnel weapons and aid to Ukraine. And at that point, the U.S. president can wait until there is a Russian breakthrough, or alternatively, or maybe both, a breakdown of the Ukrainian war effort, in which case the U.S. can then insert itself to help broker a peace. But it is essential that the U.S. not own the war in terms of the allied or coalition side, the Ukrainian side, and be in a position where it takes responsibility.
Do you agree? Trump has achieved that. We do not own it. We do not have a part in it. They're not going to say who lost Ukraine.
Yeah, no, because he's made that point emotionally, and that should stick as long as there isn't continuing reversal policies stated, which is what happened under Mr. Biden. You recall, Mr. Biden said, this man must go early on in the war, and then that had to be walked back. And it happened again and again and again, but that isn't going to happen this time. As long as he continues to pull back and withhold the U.S. from continuing involvement, and that could mean a lot more than just supplying arms. Obviously, it means supplying C4ISR. It involves planning operations, et cetera, et cetera. If all that is done, then I think the U.S. will be in a good position to step in. And I'll tell you what Mr. Trump wants, because it's very clear. He would like to be able to step in after Ukraine has been defeated on the battlefield, and then broker a peace that ends the war on balanced terms, balanced meaning the nature of the situation on the front at that time, just like Theodore Roosevelt did as president in 1904 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brokering an end to the Russo-Japanese War. And it was a very fair settlement in the sense that Russia, the loser in the war with Japan, had been decisively beaten. And yet he was able to salvage things that made it appear to be a fair settlement given the war situation at its termination, that is to say, at the war's termination. And for that, he got the Nobel Prize. Well, here is the goal of the successor president, Mr. Trump, and it is a goal within reach. And I think that this could be the outcome of the war. But it first requires that the president pull out, really, and say, oh, this was never my war, and it wasn't. It was Mr. Biden's war. And before that, to some extent, Mr. Obama, but it was really Biden's war because, as you recall, President Obama gave Mr. Biden the portfolio for Ukraine way back in his presidency before 2014. And Mr. Biden was the guy who oversaw all of the intrigues and machinations that actually led to the war escalating in 2022.
All right, so what we have here is a stand down by the Trump administration. You guys do it. They're not evidencing any energy to solve it. Are we looking at the breakup of Yugoslavia again, the breakup of Ukraine? Would that be an acceptable outcome? We have a couple of minutes before we move on.
Well, the Ukrainian civil war, which is to say, if you want to compare it to Yugoslavia, is much more straightforward. Yugoslavia was 6 or even more, depending on how you want to slice things,
a mess.
National identities. Yeah. And it was impossible. It still hasn't been solved, re Kosovo or Bosnia. But this is a straightforward split in Ukraine. You have Russian Ukraine, and then you have the other Ukraine, which itself is somewhat amorphous. And I think that a solution to this is to find a settlement, and a Russian victory will have the virtue of forcing Ukraine to desire to come to terms. That's the main utility of a Russian victory. Now, it's not necessarily in taking more territory, and Russia, meaning Mr. Putin and the Russian people, do not want to hurt Ukraine any more than they have to be honest. But there does have to be a settlement, and a settlement requires a Russian victory. That's just the reality of the situation.
Are we closer to it, Germanicus?
We're closer every day. I mean, yesterday there was a large breakthrough. Russia has reached a point where it is now inserting itself between the ever dwindling and shrinking forces of Ukraine, and it is making bigger and bigger gains on the battlefield all along the line of contact. And at some point, that's going to start to unravel. But, as we've said week by week, that is not possible to predict precisely. I believe it will be happening within the course of the summer into the fall, but that's just a feeling.
Germanicus, Michael Vlahos, I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're in Londinium. It's a cool evening, and we've enjoyed ourselves talking to the Centurions about their campaigns. There is nothing especially new on the Ukrainian front, although we repeat ourselves just because the Europeans refuse to move. Now, there's a big NATO meeting coming up, and I believe it's in the Netherlands, Holland, in these next weeks, July, I believe. And we'll see who takes the lead there, if anyone. It's not clear that they even want to take the lead. I think Europe would like the U.S. to take care of this, but Mr. Trump's been definitive. He can change his mind, but it certainly doesn't look that way right now. We're going to turn ourselves to the U.S. Congress. And Germanicus and I have been debating the 4th century A.D., the end of the Roman Empire, the early Roman Empire, and what happens in the 5th century is Attila the Hun. Okay, before that, we're going to speak to the power of the Senate in relationship to the emperor after the empire is Christianized by Constantine. Germanicus and I have been enjoying ourselves talking about what's going to happen in the 4th century to the Roman Empire after Constantine declares Christianity the religion that he favors. It takes the rest of that century for the Roman Empire to move itself towards a place where all officials are then mandated to be Christianized. In fact, in that period between Constantine and the end of the 4th century, there are so many temples that are deconstructed that there's a flood of secondhand marble on the market, so the prices collapse. To tell you what kind of changes were going on in our Roman Empire. But we come to the way the Roman Senate conducted itself with regard to the emperor in Constantinople and the emperor in Rome. There was an uneven balance here. Rome never really led after the 4th century. But there was an attempt to say that there are two emperors and we can rule together. I want to speak the conduct of the Roman Senate at this time, the Roman Empire Senate, because Germanicus, in these last days, we've had a demonstration of what is said to be Congress moving effectively to respond to the Trump agenda, i.e. tax cuts. Okay. And after the celebration in the House, the Senate now takes up the debate about a tax cut, which has a lot of moving parts. I don't need to sympathize with it or alienate myself from the people who regard it as either critical or breaking the bank. You can go back and forth. I just want to note the process. We know in the 4th century, when the Senate came together and approved the emperor, in this case it was Theodosius, it's quite fantastic. Michael and I have debated these sayings. They're in a book by Peter Heather called The Fall of the Roman Empire. They would come together and shout out these things repeatedly. What things? This is the Senate, guys in togas, okay? Yeah, there's a Jane Austen element here. You got to marry the right person. But still, this is the Senate. This is the equivalent of Apple standing next to Google, standing next to NVIDIA, standing next to General Motors. You understand, the Senate. They would shout out 23 times, "We give thanks for this regulation of yours," meaning the emperor. 23 times, 23 more times. "You have removed the ambiguities in the imperial constitutions," 23 times. "Pious emperors thus wisely planned," 26 times. "You wisely provide for lawsuits. You provide for the public peace." I'll stop. Germanicus, in reading through this again, I was reminded very much of how the Congress acted when Mr. Biden was president, and they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was one great package to the green industries of America.
Yes.
Then, now that they've passed this, the House has moved this tax bill, 215 to 214, they shouted out the acclamation about how it's going to save us, how it's going to revive the economy, how this is the building block for the future. And it tells me that in 2,000 years, we've achieved nothing in terms of the Congress being more effective than the Senate. And the underlying question, and I'll put it to you, Germanicus, is the Republic gone? We know it was gone in the 4th century AD. Is it gone in 21st century America? Is the Republic not even a dream, just a talking point?
The American Republic really began to unravel during the long reign of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he, in effect, became an emperor with some limitations imposed by the residual authority of the Republican Party. And the Cold War then, after World War II, essentially extended the authority that World War II had given the president to be the emperor. And the emperor, of course, in Latin is imperator, which means general. And so the idea that the president was the commander-in-chief, the generalissimo, became entrenched in American life. And by the Kennedy period, and especially as it unfolded in the reign of Lyndon Johnson, the term imperial presidency gained currency in the imperial city. And ever since, American presidents have been judged by their ability to be effective generalissimos, to be imperators, emperors, to command the forces of the United States and to essentially represent the United States and be its supreme authority. So the republic, as it had existed in the United States, as it had existed in Rome before Julius and then Augustus Caesar, or better yet, going back to the second century BC, is gone. And one of the key elements in the transformation from republic to empire is not simply that the identity, the authority, the agenda of the empire is increasingly vested in a single person and the imperial court that surrounds him, but that the institutions of the republic itself, in Rome's case, the Senate, in our case, Congress, which is bicameral, moves from being a deliberative body that makes the laws and essentially runs the administration of the republic, of the nation. It moves toward being an acclamatory body. It still is important in the administrative process because the senators representing the most powerful men in the empire are needed to serve as governors of provinces and in many other ways. And yet, what is most desired is that these most powerful men in the empire as a class are brought to heel in the sense that they, rather than representing any kind of threat to imperial authority, become one of its major reinforcers or boosters. So their acclamatory authority is what is most desired, and that's why you see all these repetitions in the ritual. The acclamation that occurs is similar to the sort of acclamation you see in a religious ceremony like a mass, and here it has tremendous political significance because you have the most important men in the empire constantly in unison, collectively acclaiming the work of the emperor. And they're not making the laws. They're not making the code. The code is the Theodosian code of the Emperor Theodosius II. And that code was written and then promulgated by a committee that he chose. It wasn't the act of the Senate in any way. And so what the acclamatory process does is to reinforce the authority of the emperor and his legitimacy. Now, before, in the Republic, the Senate had made the laws. So they were their legitimacy was rooted in the fact that they made laws. Now it's all about the emperor's legitimacy, and it's essential to have the Senate then, which still has the freighted symbolism of being the source of legitimacy, right? Because that's what they used to do. They used to be the makers of the laws of the Republic. It is essential that this body and its traditions of being the source of legitimacy thus are translated into, through acclamation, the givers of legitimacy to the emperor so that he has the legitimacy. It is one of the most powerful elements of the Roman transformation from republic to empire is this sense of acclamation. The emperor has no legitimacy and would have no authority by main force, by simply killing people and bringing in the legions to control the population. It didn't work that way. The emperor still needed, and this would go all the way into the 15th century in Byzantium, the emperor still needed to be acclaimed by the source of legitimacy, which was the Senate.
One turn of the screw. We fancy that we have two parties and that there's a difference between them. Rome didn't bother with that. It was a uniparty state, like the Soviet Union, like the People's Republic of China. When I close my eyes and imagine the voices of the Senate and the Congress, do we have a uniparty state? It begins to bother me that there's no difference between them.
Of course we do. That's what we've had all along. That's why the global war on terror was supported ardently by both parties. And that's why you have essentially the same kind of people pushing the same agendas with merely titular or nomenclatural
Are they
variations to distinguish them. The change occurred, though, with the rise of Mr. Trump, because you then get this populism, which no longer was willing to put up with a uniparty system, and that's where you get the voice of the people demanding to be heard, and that's caused some instability, I have to say.
We've got Gracchus. Here we go again. The Gracchus. Right. Are they self-aware? Is the Senate self-aware that it's the same on both sides of the aisle?
They are on the Republican side because they've had to go through what the Greeks would later call proskionesis. They had to prostrate themselves to the emperor. But the important thing is that on the Democrat side, they tried to reassert their power as the Senate and overthrow, even assassinate the emperor, and they failed. So now they're in a position right now of coming to terms with the new reality. And we have yet to see how that will work its way through. Perhaps what the Democrats will do is to find an emperor to replace the Republican emperor, and then you run into the issue of potential civil wars, a la the many, many civil wars that marked Rome.
Yeah, we do enjoy that. We're going to turn to the emperor because there's a new book called Original Sin by two members of the Fourth Estate about Mr. Biden. However, we're going to extend our remarks to include Mr. Trump and indeed future emperor presidents. There is a new book, Original Sin, by two members of the Fourth Estate. And in that book, they identify with often anonymous sources that Mr. Biden was troubled with cognition from the moment he decided to run for the presidency in 19. And that the people around him were aware of it and explained it to themselves as, that's Joe Biden. I don't limit myself to remarks about Joe Biden. I limit myself to remarks about age and what it does to the ability to remember, to perform, to hold things together. I am no senior, but I'm certainly 77 years old, and I'm aware that there is a limitation to my acuity, and it's coming. That is part of the aging process, and I'm lucky to be here. What we observe with Mr. Biden, according to this book, I don't have any independent source, just according to Original Sin, is that the deterioration accelerated. Starting in the first year, there was no delay, and that part of the deterioration involves a good day, bad day formula. Sometimes you can be extremely sharp and conduct yourself in an exuberant fashion, perhaps because you're having a good day, or because there are good things around you, or people are being loving. And then all of a sudden the energy is drained out of you. That is something that's observed in this Original Sin book. Here's why it's important. There is a revelation in a new biography of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow, the distinguished biographer, that towards his end of his life, Mark Twain came in with Halley's Comet in 1936 and went out with Halley's Comet in 1910. In 1908, he was living in his built-for home in Connecticut, Stormfeld. And he was taken care of by two hired assistants, Ashcroft, 34 years old, and Isabel Lyon, 45 years old, the housekeeper. They cared for him a great deal, and at night they'd sit around and smoke and drink whiskey with him and tell stories, and they all enjoyed each other's company. However, the revelation came over time that the reason his two daughters were alienated from the house and the reason Ashcroft and Lyon were enjoying themselves is that they were slowly taking over all of his affairs, so much so that they had him sign a document that gave them the power of attorney. Meanwhile, Lyon, the 45-year-old woman who had a good working relationship with him, and Mark Twain's daughters thought she was trying to marry him, and nothing wrong. He was 74 years old. She was 45. It was imaginable. But she was taking petty cash and building up her own estate nearby. When all of this was revealed, Mark Twain was humiliated, and he dealt with it as best he can. We're not talking about millions. But in the book, we come to this passage. This is Ron Chernow. I highly recommend the book. I've just started it. But I went to this passage at the end about the Ashcroft-Lyon fiasco because it reveals Mark Twain towards the end of his life, and I'm sympathetic. He was 74, I'm 77. It reads this way. Mark Twain finds this in a periodical. This is the quote. Old people, though in all appearance still independent and responsible, are often entirely under the suggestive influence of some masterful or interested person who had succeeded in mastering the master's mind. In such cases, the intriguer knew how to apply his suggestions so as to rule at last the whole household. Twain sat thunderstruck after he read this and admitted to a friend, it describes my case minutely, exactly, vividly, and with most humiliating truthfulness. Germanicus, I'm not only attaching this revelation from Mark Twain to Joseph Biden, which is evident to everyone now that they have original sin, they're reporting. I'm also saying we're at risk with Mr. Trump as well. It's not their personality, it's not their language, it's the age, and you can't be sure. Mark Twain, there's nobody sharper, and yet he realized that he'd fallen for it. How do you respond to this Twain quote? Thank you, Germanicus.
The susceptibility of people in power, and Mark Twain held no office, but he was, by the time he died in 1910, he was really one of the most powerful Americans because of his incredible stature and authority. And it wasn't simply literary. But those who reach those elevated stations, especially in politics, are always susceptible. And often what the Romans would call the cursus honorum, the course of honor, meant that you would reach the highest pinnacle in your life at an advanced age, and you would be susceptible then to the blandishments of courtiers. And that's what happened to Tiberius, obviously.
Yes.
It also happened to weak emperors or impaired emperors like Caligula, who obviously suffered from an impairment, and also those who were extremely weak, like Nero, or those who were also both weak and addled, like Commodus. And those were times of great danger to the empire, because one of the problems, as we've been talking about an emperor system, is the emperor needs to be really the man, and he needs to be in charge and capable. And a weak emperor is an invitation to constitutional disaster, because it invites the courtiers that surround the emperor to begin to control the emperor, and then to make common cause with ambitious or oppositional factions within the Senate. And this leads to assassinations, and then to civil wars. And it is not remarkable that Rome had a year of 4 emperors and a year of 5 emperors. It's not remarkable that the U.S. had a year of 5 emperors in 2024. It's the thing. It's, to use the modern cliche, it's the weakest link in an imperial system, and therefore, what Rome did after Diocletian and Constantine was to try and come up with some pathway that would ensure a smooth succession. That was the Tetrarchy, but also to find ways to ensure that emperors were properly selected. That was certainly done after Nerva, who succeeded Domitian, and that system worked exceptionally well for a century. But again, the whole weakest link issue means that at some point that smooth handoff will end, and that there'll be what they call a discontinuity, a disruption, and most likely a civil war. And this is something that faces America now that the United States is deeply intertwined with an imperial constitution. It is remarkable that the American Constitution has held, but I think the American Constitution has held the same way the Roman Constitution, the imperial constitution, held, and that was through the laws. That's why the Codex Theodosianus and later Justinian's code are so important, because associating the code with the emperor and his authority and as the means of legitimacy was what kept the empire going. And it was not possible for a real usurper to make it. But nonetheless, you have the situation as we've had with Mr. Biden.
I want you to speak to age specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Biden was extremely suggestible by a man named Ron Klain, who was his chief of staff the first 2 years and then became a guardian angel in the second 2 years after he had a health incident. This is all an original sin. I'm not giving anything out of school here. There are other people around him, 4 or 5 of them, who were actually called the Politburo inside the White House. And they made decisions and had documents signed by the president. And there's an indication that he didn't remember signing some documents. For example, the one banning building natural gas, liquefied natural gas exports. He didn't remember signing that it was banned. He thought he'd signed a study. He told us this. Now, that's what happened to Mark Twain. And I'm not going to limit this just to Joe Biden. Donald Trump is of an age. I'm of an age where you worry about your ability to focus and concentrate all the time. I think that we've assumed the Tiberius problem, and we do not have I don't think there's a check and balance on it.
But the problem with people who've reached a pinnacle of power at the same time that their mental acuity begins to nosedive and decline is one in which people who have really become, they can no longer distinguish between the person they were and the person they are. And the person they were was so capable of getting them to where they are at the pinnacle that they still believe that they are the same person. It is remarkable that Mark Twain was able to step outside of himself and see what was going on.
Because I have an example. Right now, we just had a flash. Trump said 50% EU tariffs last week. The market just dumped stocks, because what are we doing here? The bond market reacted. Just came through a flash in the 21st century that Trump will delay the 50% EU till July 9th. Now, that's not statesmanship. That's game playing. All right, fine. Maybe it's successful, but it will suggest to some that there's some suggestibility here that we can't see. That's true now with Mr. Biden. We can see it now because we have this testimony. Now, many people saw it while he was in office, but now it's easier for them to tell these anecdotes.
Yes.
So I don't have a solution, Germanicus. I'm laying this out. I'm saying I want to honor people's seniority, but do we need a governance on this? Strom Thurmond reached the age of 100 in the Senate. And there are other examples. There are a lot of 80-year-olds in the Senate.
Well, there's Mugabe. He was still president of Zimbabwe at 90.
Now, perhaps the Senate is a large enough body of princes that your inability to recall facts is not weigh upon you. You have staff. But that's not true in the Oval Office. The president's word is magnificently important. And we know what happened with Tiberius. Sejanus happened with Tiberius. That was not a good thing, Germanicus.
Well, we know what happened with Mr. Biden. It was Ron Klain. It's the same thing. But very few leaders last into their mid to later 70s. One of the few who did was...
Far with a healthy generation coming up, Germanicus. Our children easily be 100.
Yes, I know. And that's going to make it very hard because you'll have increasing numbers of outwardly vigorous and yet inwardly perhaps less so leaders. And because of the nature of seniority in our system, and also because when you rise in power, you also build around yourself a brand. And your franchise as the next emperor becomes your basic source of strength and the pillar of support to all those who believe in you, which is, of course, true of Trump, more so than Biden. But you're going to have probably a string of older people running things, and that does not bode well for this particular empire.
The book Original Sin makes a very ironic point. The people who spent the most time with him noticed it less than those who just occasionally came across him. Isn't that fun?
It is fun because it's a sort of Stockholm syndrome for courtiers.
And I'm not looking to blame here. I'm really not.
No,
we've talked about it a long time, and there's maybe he was lucky to get to that age in that job, in that position. He certainly wasn't somebody
You can say shorter lifespans mean better emperors. Not a happy thought, though.
Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're going to the theater. We don't know what's going to be there. There's been random choices recently because the spring has been cold, and crossing the English Channel when it's cold is a challenge. However, we'll get lucky. We will. And we'll sacrifice to the god Augustus on our way. You bet. This is the Friends of History Debating Society, live from Londinium. I'm John Batchelor.